Welcome to this topic video on JavaScript This, or This in JavaScript. Our learning objectives will be to first review the purpose of the this keyword, understand how its value in JavaScript can be context dependent, learn the values it takes in different contexts, and learn how to set its value, if necessary, with apply, call, and the bind methods. We'll be going more over the bind method in later lectures. Okay, some good readings. The magic of this keyword, MDN on this, and understanding this keyword in JavaScript. All of those are recommended. So, what do we mean? This keyword, okay? JavaScript borrows the this keyword from C++, where it's used to point to an instance of an object from within its own class definition. What does that mean? Oh, so let's have an example. So I am creating an object, or I've got an object. Here's object literal. No constructors or anything complicated here. I'm defining an object. It's got properties, name, wind, sail, and it's got a function, description. The description is going to return a string describing things. Okay, this is my session, like a windsurfing or a kite surfing or wing dinging session. Okay, whatever type of sailing you like to do. Or not. Okay. For this method, I call it a method sitting in an object, to get at the name, wind, and sail properties, it has to use the this keyword. Okay. This is like in C++, like what we see in Java and other similar languages. Okay. So let's check that out, see how it works, mess around with it a little bit. Okay. See that it behaves like we're used to. Okay, so we define this object. It's an object literal. We can have functions in object literal. So we're my session dot description. We run the function, and it has this function is able to access these inner properties right there in the object without a problem. Let's try changing some of those properties. So let's say the wind goes down to 17 miles per hour. Then we'd probably have to go with a larger sail size, equals 7.7 meters. Okay. Now, let's see what happens if we call that function again. Description. Oh, the function works as we think. It takes those whatever values are currently done. It's not like it's taking the old values and remembering them. It updates as every time you call it. Okay, so it's referencing these variables live. Okay, so to do that, it's using the this keyword before the name, before the property names. Okay, so this name, this sail, etc. Okay, so that's the purpose of this. Okay, now this, if we're using a function to construct objects, you can see this would be handy. Or if we're using the newer JavaScript class syntax, you'd see that this would be important too. So it's going to play a role in object-oriented programming in JavaScript. Okay. However, according to the magic of this keyword reference, the original designer of JavaScript decided to tie a secondary feature to this keyword. Not only is used to point to an instance of the object from its own constructor or its methods, okay, it is also used to keep track of execution context, which is often based on where a function is called from. Okay. Let's see what that's about. Okay. These guys will tell us that the duality, this dual use of this keyword, is exactly what has caused so much confusion, okay? And why people tear out their hair over this keyword in JavaScript as compared to C++, okay? So you're used to C++, you're used to Java, and you come to JavaScript and this is getting changed around. Is it the fault of JavaScript? Did the designers really have a choice? Let's investigate. Okay, I'm not a language designer. Okay, from MDN, they will tell you this behaves a little different than other language. It sometimes is determined, okay, by how a function is called. Okay, so how a function is called. Okay, it may be different. Okay, each time the function is called. That doesn't help too much. Let's get hands-on. I think if we get hands-on, this is going to start clearing things up. First of all, let's take this little piece of code right here. Let's go console log this. See what we get. Console log this. I claim it's going to point to the window object, and lo and behold, it does. Okay, it returns the window object with all its complicated stuff in it. Okay. Why should it do that? Well, this is the global context. Okay. Where are we right here? We're in window. Okay. We're in the window object. Okay. Anything we want to get to, we're in the context window. Now, what happens if we go to node? Go to node. So here's the node from the command line. If I go console.log and I type this, what's going to happen? Object. It's returning some kind of global object. It's got some properties and things in it, like intervals and timeouts and stuff like that. I don't know what it's about, but it's a global object. Why isn't it the window object? Because there's no browser here. So even node has the concept of a global this object, the global context. It can't be the same as in the browser because we don't have the DOM. Okay. .x. Okay. So we see this always gets a value. And without it being anywhere, any other context, it's going to be the global object, which in your browser is window, which in node is this global thing. Okay? So far, so good. Now, okay, we did this example. We defined a function that console log this. Okay? Now, let's look at this in the context of an object. Okay? So here I'm going to create a couple objects. My object with one property called name, my thing, another object with the name, other thing. Okay? Now we're going to create a method after the fact on our object. Will this even work? My object dot, adding a new property, which is a function, going to console log this. Okay? Then we're going to call that. Okay? Then we're going to try doing different things with it. Okay? So let's copy this whole thing out and let's go through this slowly, one at a time. Okay. We're going to paste that all, but we don't want to run it all yet. So we're going to get rid of this. Okay. So let's do this one at a time. First of all, we created two objects, my object too. So my object, okay. Thing, it's got a method attached. So that was allowed, okay. We were allowed to attach the method to it, Okay. Okay. Function method, some method, blah, blah, blah. Okay. Now, so that allowed us to do that. Now, let's try calling some method. Okay. What does some method do? So we created this method, assigned it to my object, said some method is function, console log this. Run it. Oh, it logged and printed out our object. What's our object? Oh, the object up here that we gave a name, my thing. We assigned a method to it, so that's a property. Okay, great. Now, did the designers of JavaScript really have a choice about this little bit of extra confusion that this can vary with context? Remember, in JavaScript, we're allowed to take methods, we're allowed to take any function and assign it to a variable, okay? Any function, okay? So we're going to see if they allow us to do this, okay? We're going to take this, our object, which has a method attached, we're going to pull out that function, that method, okay? Not as be evaluating it, but as a function that hasn't been evaluated, and assigning it to a variable. Then we're going to try calling it. Okay? Let's see what it does. First of all, it didn't error. So JavaScript allows us to pass around functions however we like. We can take them out of objects, assign them to variables. Now, should this method have remembered that it was part of this object? Or should it understand that's in a new context? It seems to have forgotten, okay? Because what did it do? It didn't print out the old object from which it came. It printed out the global context like it had no other idea of what this should be. Oh, interesting. Let's try something else. Now, way down here, you see this down here. I got to bring that up. Okay. Now, here we're going to take my object, some method. Okay. We did that over here. Some method. So over here, we defined it in my object. We're going to pull it out and assign it to my object 2. We're going to create a new field property for my object 2. We're going to assign it equal to the method, and then we're going to try calling it. What do you think is going to happen? This time, when it console logs this, oh, we get, first of all, we're calling it with its new name. We get the object again. The context is back to the object, okay? Which kind of makes sense because we'd like to be able to share functions. If we're going to be able to share and move functions around from place to place, how should they behave when they're associated with objects? Well, if they're associated and called from the context of an object, it makes sense that this belongs to that, should be set to that object. If there's no notion of it, then it makes sense not. Okay, so maybe this isn't as confusing as possible when you take into account we're working with a scripting language where you can pull out functions and assign them to any variable you want. And depending on how you call that function, okay, it matters how you set this. Let's go one more extreme. So we know, okay, let's call var another func equal my obj2 dot a method. Okay, we're not evaluating it. We're taking this function out of the object and assigning it to a variable. Now we're going to call it another func Now, are we calling it from an object like here? No, we're just calling it without any context. When this method gets called, okay, and it goes to log this, we see that it doesn't have any of this other than the global context. Okay, so depending on how we call this thing, so this is what they mean by context, and we'll see a couple others, but this is the most important. Depending on how we call this thing, it may or may not be bound to a particular object. Okay, but if you think about that, that kind of makes sense because we can pull out functions and give them to other objects or use them in other ways. Okay. Let's see a slightly different context. Now, I don't particularly use this way of grabbing things, but here is the event context. Okay. Here we're going to have a click target. Okay, so in my actual code, this is the code that I've got behind this, all this. Okay, I go grab the element, which is this thing. It's my element. I'm going to have this function, okay, some function, console log this. Add event listener, click, some method. So the question is, what's it going to print? I don't need to copy this because where is it? This stuff. Go look at the inspector. Let's go right to here. This H4 right here. Okay. So I'm actually being I'm showing you the code that's right here underneath. Okay. So this is the nice pretty printed code. This is the actual code in here that's running. Okay. So this is going to be my target. I'm going to click on it. This is going to be the window object. Let's see. Let's go to the console. Click target. Wow, it's not the window object. It's the target. It's the H4. It brought back the H4. Now, I usually always use the event parameter for events and grab stuff that way. If you see some super terse code that all of a sudden in the event handler uses this to get stuff and things like that, now you know where they're doing that from. I haven't really used that method as much, okay? So I don't usually use this way of getting at event information. I usually use the event parameter, okay? But we see that in events, the context is yet again different. Okay, not that you have to keep this memorized, okay? What about arrow functions? Arrow functions. What are arrow functions? Where is the arrow function here? Here's the arrow function. Okay. What's this thing doing? This is a constructor function. How can I tell it's a constructor function? Well, they're using uppercase as a hint, but I see this. When I see this inside it, I understand it's a constructor function. I also see by their use here, they're calling new on it. Okay, so this is a constructor function. If you don't remember your constructor functions, ignore this example. Okay, but what's going to happen here? This is one of these arrow functions. Okay, this is a long arrow function. I usually prefer to use them for short functions, not long functions. But arrow functions have a different way of dealing with this. Basically, they don't do anything to it. Okay. They will take this from the outer context. Okay. Now, like I said, I got this example from MDN. People freak out with set interval, but what is it doing? This is a callback. Okay, so we're defining a callback function here via the arrow function mechanism, and we're setting the time. So what does the set interval do? It allows us to repeatedly call this thing, okay, every 1,000 milliseconds, okay? It's going to increment a variable, an internal variable, age, if this code works, if this context is this inside the arrow function is the same as outside. That's true. It's going to increment the age. It's got to check on things. Let's take a copy of this and try running it. This will take a little while to run. Okay, so let me clear that up. We're going to print this out here. Instead of new person, we're going to say new Dr. B. Okay. We're going to run that. First, it did not crash. Okay? We didn't get an error saying this name is undefined. Okay? This age is undefined. It was able to use this outer, this context. Otherwise, if I define a function in here, okay, it will error. Okay. This is taking a little while to run. And what's the trick at the end? Notice when they use set interval, they make this function call this huge function here. Okay. They return a value. It gets set to this timer. This is how, with this timer, we can use clear interval to turn off this particular timer. You can have multiple timers. You can have multiple different things going on. Okay. Let's clear this out and let's show this crashing. Okay. So how are we going to do that? We're going to take this code, copy it again just in case, and we're going to rewrite it a little bit. Okay. So we're going to say function, an empty function. Oh, so we're going to just convert this from an arrow function quickly to a function. We didn't have to do much. Okay, new person, Dr. B. Why are we doing this? To see if we get different behavior. And I think we're going to get way different behavior. Man is old. Wow. It couldn't get at anything. Okay. The timer stuff didn't work. All sorts of things. Oh no, look at this number here. It's incrementing. So the timer thing's going on. I don't think it's ever going to stop though. Why? Because we can't get at this timer to shut it off. Let's see. No. Okay, so Nan is old. So what happened is, in our new function that we set up here, okay, when we use this set this, it lost the context, okay, of the this, okay. So it wasn't able to find name, age, or timer. So it just keeps going and keeps going, okay. So this was a case where an arrow function came in handy. Okay. Don't worry about it. We're going to, if you don't remember this behavior of arrow function, we're going to have another way to ensure that this gets correctly set up. Okay. How's that? We have functions are first class objects. If we go and we look at functions, okay, we never use a function constructor to create a function, but we see the arguments, we see all these various things, okay, number of arguments expected, blah, 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 all sorts of things. But look, we have instance methods, apply, bind, and call. Each one of these, they work slightly different. Apply takes the this, you can give it a this argument, okay, to use in it, okay, and an array full of arguments. Call takes a this argument, okay, and calls it with a bunch of separately listed arguments, okay, so different syntax. This one's a separate listing of arguments. This one is all the arguments for the function fed as an array. Both these things, call and apply, both these methods actually call the function. Bind works differently. Bind creates a new function that when it's called has its this appropriately set to the this arguments and optionally we'll bind arguments. Okay, we're going to see what this is useful for in our next, when we get to React class components. Okay, so let's see some of these in action, just with the this properties. Okay, we're going to create an object. We're going to have a function, standing out loud. It doesn't do anything useful, console log this. Then we're going to try it. We're going to try it with apply. We're going to try it with call. We're going to try creating a new function via bind, and then calling that new function afterwards. Okay, so let's do it. Okay, copied. Open up our console. Okay. Paste. Do these things one at a time. Okay. We have an object. We have a function. My function. Oh, it's just logging this. It's not called in any context otherwise, so it's going for the global object. Next example. We're going to use the function method. Functions have methods? How bizarre. Yep, they do. We're going to use apply. Calls a function and sets this to the provided this argument. Okay. Run it. Ah, nice binding. Okay. So we're able to call my function and force it or give it and set it's this argument explicitly. Okay. Let's try call. Professor, it looks just the same. Yeah, it does, because we weren't adding more arguments after the fact, right? We gave it this, so here's apply and call. The difference is one takes things as an array of arguments. The other one takes up as many arguments as you want individually. Bind's different. Let's take a look at bind. Okay, bind. Okay, what's new function? It's a function. It's a function equal to my function. Oh, so it hasn't been evaluated. Okay, this is a function that's yet to be called. This will be real handy in a bunch of contexts with callbacks and things like that in React and in other places. Okay. Bind is very powerful, and we'll look more at it in our React class components lecture, even though some of that stuff is independent of class components. Okay, so now let's try running new func. How do we run new func? Oh, we have to call it. Okay. So this new func has this bound to it, so whenever we call it new func, it still has it. Okay. Very interesting. So it's bound to it. Okay. So, as a quick review on the bind approach is particularly well suited to assigning this to a function that will be passed as a callback. Okay. So particularly like in that, we can use that in our set interval example before. So we could use a regular function rather than an arrow function. In this case, we would not want to evaluate the function, just bind a specific object to this. Okay. Sometimes the other alternative would be an arrow function, but sometimes you don't want to remember too many methods, so a lot of times you'll see me using bind as my primary way of ensuring this gets assigned to something. All right, I hope that helps clear up some of the ideas about this keyword in JavaScript.